Katalis is a unique 5-year government-backed business development program that unlocks the vast potential of economic partnerships between Australia and Indonesia.
Beautiful tropical beaches, year-round sunshine. This place may well be the next best sunny holiday destination the world will get to know. And I'll give you a clue. It's not Bali. There are 5 destinations Indonesia would want tourists to embrace, deemed the super priority tourism destinations. Lake Toba in North Sumatra, Borobudur in Central Java, Mandalika in West Nusa Tenggara, Likupang in North Sulawesi, and Labuan Bajo in East Nusa Tenggara. It's Labuan Bajo we'd like to talk about in this episode for a couple of reasons. First, it's where the ASEAN leaders recently converged for their annual summit, which this year is chaired by Indonesia. Having visited Labuan Bajo a few times now, it may even be President Joko Widodo's new favourite.
Promosikan juga Labuan Bajo sebagai destinasi berprioritas. Di Golomor ini bagus, kita lihat di yang Labuan Bajo juga bagus saya kira.
Second, as a prime destination, Labuan Bajo is keen to embrace sustainable tourism, a concept much embraced as the next big thing. And by the way, the area is also dubbed the gateway to the land of Komodo dragons. Today, my co-host Sondang Sirait and I speak with Alfonso Pardede, CEO of PT Flores Prosperindo, an Indonesian premium developer with assets in Labuan Bajo, and Dr Campbell Drake, sustainable tourism expert from the University of Technology, Sydney. The interview with Alfonso is in Bahasa Indonesia, but you'll find the English translation on the Katalis website.
Selamat pagi, Yang Mulia para pemimpin ASEAN. Selamat datang di KTT ke-42 ASEAN di Labuan Bajo, Indonesia.
Pak Alfonso, pertama-tama selamat atas berlangsungnya KTT ASEAN di Labuan Bajo dan Tanah Mori. Tentunya panjang sekali ya Pak proses dan perjalanan menuju tahapan ini. Nah, bolehkah Bapak cerita ke kita bagaimana, seperti apa prosesnya sampai dipilih menjadi tuan rumah acara KTT ASEAN?
Ya, terima kasih Bu Sondang. Memang ini menjadi perjalanan yang panjang ya bagi Tanah Mori ya. Dan ini dimulai ketika pada tahun 2017 beberapa menteri melakukan investment roadshow ke Australia. Dan setelah kembalinya ke Indonesia, maka mulai dilihat potensi Labuan Bajo untuk ditawarkan ke Australia. Kami sendiri, FP atau Flores Prosperindo, akhirnya menjadi salah satu developer yang akan disupport serta ditawarkan ke investor Australia. Dan mulai tahun 2018, FP melakukan kerjasama dengan ITDC untuk menyiapkan satu kawasan pariwisata kelas dunia. Mulai dari penyiapan Vision Master Plan, Feasibility Study oleh konsultan-konsultan kelas dunia juga. Dan proses ini terus berjalan hingga akhirnya di kuartal 4 tahun 2019. Pak Presiden menyampaikan bahwa Indonesia akan menjadi presidensial untuk event G20 dan KTT ASEAN atau ASEAN Summit di tahun 2023. Dan beliau ingin lokasinya berada selain Bali, dan tentunya ini sejalan dengan program 10 New Bali pada saat itu ya. Maka dimulailah kunjungan Pak Luhut Panjaitan, Menko Marves ke Tanah Mori di akhir tahun 2019, dan dilanjutkan dengan kunjungan Presiden ke Labuan Bajo di awal tahun 2020. Dan dimulai juga persiapan atas hal-hal tersebut. Namun memang di Maret 2020 mulai terjadi pandemi COVID dan semua rencana menjadi tertunda. Namun akhirnya setelah kondisi semakin membaik, pemerintah mengeluarkan Perpres nomor 116 tahun 2021, di mana isinya bahwa dilakukan percepatan pembangunan infrastruktur, baik itu di luar kawasan Tanah Mori dan di dalam kawasan Tanah Mori, terkait persiapan KTT ASEAN di tahun 2023.
Nah, ada beberapa destinasi super prioritas di Indonesia, tapi Pak Jokowi memilih Labuan Bajo. Bahkan dengar-dengar beliau sudah lebih dari 3 kali ya Pak ke sana. Dalam tahun ini aja sudah 3 kali ke sana. Tentunya ini merupakan sebuah prestasi.
Betul sekali sih. Ya memang ini menjadi suatu berkat juga ya bagi kita ya. Tentunya Labuan Bajo dengan yang berada di pemerintah Kabupaten Manggarai Barat dan Provinsi Nusa Tenggara Timur, kami melihat bahwa ini bentuk satu komitmen ya, serius dari pemerintah ingin mengembangkan mungkin kawasan pariwisata yang berada di Indonesia bagian timur, atau mungkin daerah-daerah Indonesia bagian timur yang mungkin masih tertinggal ya secara pembangunan dan ekonomi. Dan ini juga kami lihat bagaimana support dari pemerintah juga menjadi luar biasa. Dan tentunya tidak lupa bahwa Labuan Bajo mempunyai satu attractiveness ya kelas dunia, yaitu tempat habitat beradanya Komodo dragon.
Pak Alfonso, saya pengen tahu lebih banyak tentang Tanamori, kawasan pariwisata kelas dunia, salah satu wisata atau tujuan wisata super prioritas di Indonesia. Nah, konsep utama yang diusung Tanamori adalah pariwisata berkelanjutan. Nah, secara global kalau kita lihat memang ada tren ke arah pariwisata berkelanjutan, tapi untuk Anda yang bergerak di bidang pariwisata premium, apa sih definisi konsep ini?
Betul, jadi memang sejak awal pun visi dari Tanamori adalah untuk menjadi a world class sustainable tourism destination. Dan tentunya kita sudah meletakkan pilar-pilar sustainable itu dari awal ya ke dalam master plan kita. Dan dengan pengalaman semasa pandemi COVID yang mungkin hampir 3 tahun terakhir ini, malah semakin menguatkan nih kesadaran kita semua bahwa tuntutan untuk kita merespon kembali ya, khususnya mengenai isu climate change yang terjadi belakangan ini. Dan juga mulai terjadi pergeseran paradigma ya kalau menurut kami, di mana wisatawan di masa mendatang ini akan menuntut suatu kawasan pariwisata yang bertanggung jawab terhadap aspek keberlanjutannya, terutama bagi kawasan wisata premium. Aspek keberlanjutan ini akan menjadi jawaban dari tuntutan wisatawan premium khususnya. Sehingga kami percaya bahwa konsep pengembangan wisata berpremium tidak bisa lepas dari aspek keberlanjutannya. Dan tentu ini akan menambah nilai dari kawasan tersebut yang memang terlihat ya, karena akan memberi impact positif bagi aspek sosial, ekonomi, serta lingkungan kawasan, dan tentunya semua stakeholders terkait.
Tuntutan turis tentang atau terhadap lokasi yang bertanggung jawab itu seperti apa ya, Pak?
Ya, kalau yang kami lihat sekarang mungkin terjadi perubahan ya, bahwa mungkin selama ini turis mungkin lebih senang tinggal di dalam suatu hotel, di kamar hotel atau resort, dan menikmati fasilitas yang hanya ada di dalamnya. Namun dengan terjadinya kemarin pandemi, ada sedikit perubahan bahwa sebenarnya turis ingin melakukan interaksi di luar dari kawasan hotel atau resort, sehingga mereka ingin juga bisa berkomunikasi dan berinteraksi dengan masyarakat sekitar. Nah, ini yang kami pikir bagaimana keberlanjutan itu tentunya harus dirasakan ya, atau impact positif dirasakan oleh masyarakat sekitar hotel atau kawasan tersebut itu dulu, dan baru mereka bisa menerima keberadaan turis ini.
Dan bagian dari persiapan juga terkait model bisnis, usaha Bapak dalam mengembangkan model bisnis dan merencanakan marketing Australia, seperti tadi Pak Alfonso beberapa kali mention, Australia merupakan mitra dekat Flores Prosperindo sejak awal. Nah, salah satunya yang sekarang sedang berjalan adalah melalui kemitraan dengan Katalis. Nah, apa saja rencana Flores Prosperindo untuk menarik investor Australia?
Ya, betul. Ya, tentunya dengan program yang telah kita lakukan bersama-sama ya dengan Katalis selama ini, yang mungkin dimulai dari tahun lalu. Maka ya, hal ini tentu akan menjadi suatu teaser awal untuk menarik minat-minat dari investor Australia untuk berinvestasi di Tanamori. Dan benefit dari IASEPA dan aspek keberlanjutan yang akan diusung, terus adanya rencana mungkin training ya, atau capacity building bagi masyarakat sekitar, dan juga penyiapan investment prospektus yang tepat, ini akan semakin menambah daya tarik Tanamori bagi investor Australia yang secara geografis juga tidak terlalu jauh. Dan tidak lupa dukungan penuh dari pemerintah Indonesia khususnya melalui kedutaan, konjen-konjen di Australia, terus kementerian terkait ya, contohnya Kementerian Investasi melalui Indonesia Investment Promotion Center, contohnya di Sydney gitu ya, terus Kemenparekraf, Bappenas, dan juga lembaga-lembaga kerjasama Australia Indonesia ya, seperti AIBC, Australia Indonesia Business Council, maupun IABC. Ini tentunya terus akan kami koordinasikan untuk dapat lebih banyak lagi menarik minat investor Australia untuk berinvestasi di Tanah Mori.
Dan Pak Alfonso aktif engaging dengan stakeholders di Australia. Ini apakah memang sesuai dengan visi bahwa atau harapan bahwa mayoritas turis yang datang ke Tanah Mori ditargetkan atau disasar dari Australia, Pak?
Ya, ini tepat sekali mungkin Bu Sondang. Jadi kembali lagi ketika kami memulai ya di tahun 2017, kami pikir memang spirit awalnya kami melihat Australia adalah target terdekat juga ya secara geografis bagi Tanah Mori. Dan ini memang sudah terbukti ya bahwa selama ini turis Australia juga cukup banyak ya di Bali ya, dan mungkin pernah ya menempati ranking pertama ya sebagai turis yang terbanyak datang ke Pulau Bali. Dan kalau kami lihat secara geografis, posisi Labuan Bajo atau Tanah Mori tidak terlalu jauh juga dari Bali. Dan ibaratnya mungkin Labuan Bajo ini baru bertumbuh atau berkembang. Dan bersama-sama dengan Tanah Mori ibarat Bali di tahun 80-an ya, Bu Sondang. Sehingga ini kami pikir menjadi momentum yang tepat melalui program kerjasama dengan Katalis ini untuk menarik minat baik itu turis maupun investor Australia ke depannya, seperti itu.
Pertanyaan terakhir, Pak Alfonso. Kalau Bali, semua orang sudah tahu, juga turis Australia banyak sekali yang ke Bali. Tapi untuk mereka yang belum pernah ke Labuan Bajo, ke Tanah Mori, bisa nggak berikan 3 alasan kenapa turis harus berkunjung ke Tanah Mori?
Oke, ya baik Bu Sondang. Ya mungkin pertama ya, dengan posisi Tanah Mori yang cukup dekat ya dengan Pulau Rinca ya, di mana Pulau Rinca ini bagian dari Taman Nasional Komodo, hanya sekitar 5 km ya dari laut. Maka kita bisa melihat langsung ya dengan mata telanjang keindahan ya Pulau Rinca yang merupakan salah satu bagian dari UNESCO World Heritage. Dan juga karena posisi Tanah Mori berada menghadap barat, maka kita dapat menikmati sunset secara langsung dari Tanah Mori. Nah, itu yang pertama. Mungkin yang berikutnya, yang kedua, bahwa jarak tempuh dari bandara ke Tanah Mori hanya 30 menit saja dengan menggunakan mobil. Dan nanti di sepanjang perjalanan akan banyak pemandangan juga yang cukup spektakuler ya untuk dapat dinikmati para turis. Ini juga akan menambah nilai atau daya tarik bagi Tanah Mori. Dan yang ketiga, bahwa dengan tagline Tanah Mori ya sebagai collection of wonders, maka nanti di dalam kawasan Tanah Mori akan banyak pilihan seperti atraksi ya, contohnya ada Marine World, ada theme park, ada marina, juga bahwa para turis bisa melakukan aktivitas seperti hiking, water activity dan sebagainya, dan tentu juga fasilitas-fasilitas lain yang berada di dalam kawasan Tanah Mori yang juga akan menjadi daya tarik bagi turis yang mungkin selama ini Labuan Bajo lebih identik dengan island hopping activity ya. Maka nanti di dalam Tanah Mori akan menjadi banyak pilihan, option untuk melakukan activity di mainland, dan turis akan tinggal lebih lama juga di dalam kawasan Tanah Mori.
I caught up with Dr Campbell Drake, sustainable tourism expert from the University of Technology, Sydney. Registered as an architect in the states of New South Wales and Victoria, Campbell has over 15 years professional experience specialising in sustainable ecotourism development in environmentally sensitive locations. Dr Campbell Drake, thanks so much for being on the Catalyst podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, offline, before we got started, you shared some of your background with me, which was really interesting. And now I'm going to ask you to repeat it. So do you mind just spending a couple of minutes telling us a bit about your background and how you came to the world of sustainable tourism in Indonesia?
Sure. So I'm trained as an architect. So my practice background is in ecotourism, and I've worked largely in East Africa, but also in the Seychelles and in Indonesia in was that 2000 and around 2009. I was based in the UK and I had a company there called Regional Associates, and we had this dream client who was Ugandan born but British naturalized, and he was married to the heiress of Fiat. So they were very wealthy, and he wanted to return some form of economic development in Uganda. So he commissioned us to design a series of eco lodges across Uganda and also parts of Rwanda. And we were also working on a large development in the outer islands of the Seychelles. But I have also worked at the Green School in Sabang in Bali for a couple of years. So that is, I guess, my experience working in sustainable tourism or sustainable development in those developing contexts.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And we're interested in hearing more about your thoughts on sustainable tourism in Indonesia, which seems to be a phrase that a lot of people are using these days, and many resorts refer to themselves as sustainable resorts, not just in Indonesia, but globally. It's definitely a trend that we've seen, and I understand post-COVID, the desire for sustainable holidays has increased. Is it a cliche? Like, what do we even mean by the phrase sustainable tourism?
From that perspective, I guess it's worth noting I've been undertaking this study for the last 6 years, evaluating the impact of rapid tourism development in Indonesia. So your listeners may be aware that in 2016, the central government in Indonesia released its tourism development strategy, which is kind of colloquially known as the 10 new Balis. So the idea was to replicate the Bali model in 10 discrete locations. So I've been fortunate enough to be funded by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Annually, I've done an evaluation of these destinations, which include Lombok, Mandalika, and Labuan Bajo in Flores, more recently Wakatobi in Sulawesi, and then last year I was in Lake Toba in Sumatra. So these are all what's considered priority tourism development sites. But in terms of your question in relation to tourism and whether sustainable tourism is a cliche, yes, I can understand some people's perspectives that sustainable tourism is a cliche. However, tourism always will be an important sector. And as you know, this tourism development strategy that was released in 2016 seeks to make tourism the largest revenue earner in Indonesia, to surpass oil and gas. So I think we therefore need to kind of strive towards a form of tourism that has low environmental impact and can maximise positive social impacts for local communities. So from my perspective, which is largely architectural or infrastructural, I think sustainable development, it must be derived from local materials and building methodologies. And what I mean by that is that it ensures that buildings are able to perform to local climate, seasonal variation, and a low kind of carbon intensive. And secondly, if these kinds of sustainable developments adopt these traditional building forms, then tourism can also support local economies for both material supply, construction, but also sort of maintenance. And then I would suggest that what a premise of sustainable tourism are buildings which are low energy intensive. So, and that would mean that they would incorporate more kind of passive architectural tropes, like incorporating cross ventilation ceiling fans rather than consumptive air conditioning systems. They would also take advantage of things like passive shading, existing vegetation, prevailing winds. In my evaluations across the sites I mentioned earlier in Indonesia, there's often resorts or hotels which are enormous. Just that the scale of these buildings seem really ill-fitting to their environment, and they're often in really environmentally sensitive locations such as Wakatobi in Sulawesi or Labuan Bajo or in Lake Toba. And they're often these huge 4-story concrete blocks with 100 or more rooms. So I would suggest that there does need to be some form of planning control around what constitutes sustainable tourism. And I think that's trying to be implemented, although it's more difficult in some of the regional areas. The other thing I want to mention is in terms around sustainable tourism is waste and water. Like, it's a really important consideration. Like, how does a hotel deal with its sewerage? How does it reduce its water consumption? Because often these big hotels will actually lower the water table in the dry season, which means that it's much more difficult for local communities to access water or clean water or palatable water. And lastly, I think from a sort of socially sustainable perspective, in order for these developments to be sustainable, it's really important to sort of source locally. And that's both in terms of employment and procurement. And a lot of these hotels, whether or not they employ local training programs to upskill community members. One of the hotels which you might have heard of, called Nihi or Nihiwatu, which is down in the south of Sumba, it had won the best sustainable hotel 2 years running. And we did an evaluation there, and it had recently been acquired by a new multinational. And we were very critical of a lot of their sustainable programs. So I do think that there is this kind of woke washing or greenwashing, similar to what happened in the 2000s with the oil companies that rebranded with green logos. So yes, I think that there is definitely scope to be critical of some of the self-proclaimed sustainable attributes of some hotels, but I do still think that there's a lot of merit in those that are done sort of carefully and with certain knowledge around low impact development.
Oh, really good insights. And I think you've reminded me there that when we talk about sustainable tourism, we're not just talking environmental sustainability, we're talking how well you're creating livelihoods in the community and community ownership and all kinds of other factors other than just environmental. But what I wanted to ask you is, there's no policing over calling yourself a sustainable tourism venture, is there? Like, it's kind of a label that anyone can use. So you've got to be able to look into these factors yourself, right?
Well, I did work on one project that was, I'm not quite sure where it got to, but in Labuan Bajo, there was a group of Austrian academics who were trying to develop some form of collective certification around what constitutes an eco hotel, etc. But again, it seemed at the time to be really parochial and somewhat forced. Like, I think those kinds of, I definitely think there's a more kind of ground up approach to these kind of syndicates who can, I suppose, verify how sustainable a hotel is. But I'm not aware of any kind of global or even domestic badge, if you like, that whether or not a hotel is sustainable and to how many stars it's accredited, for example.
Yeah, it's tricky. And so I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you is, when most Australians think of travel to Indonesia, they think Bali. I would say 9 out of 10, just making up a statistic, think Bali. But there are, of course, as you've discussed, many other great regions of Indonesia where there is a push for greater tourism. What advice do you have to those regions of Indonesia to sort of reach the level of awareness that Bali has, if that is indeed their ambition?
I guess that's sort of a lot of the driver of the research I've been doing in that space, is that the extent of tourism development now in Bali it's catastrophic. Like, it's so environmentally damaging, and all credit to Balinese people for its sort of resilience, and both culturally, socially, and environmentally. But a lot of those practices around, say, rice farming and the subak is being disrupted primarily because of this push for greater tourism or larger tourism. So I think there will be there is already, I think, a tipping point in Bali that it can't deal with the waste of those huge influx of people, so that now people talk about Rote in West Timor as the new Bali, or because it's so quintessentially it's paradise. Like it hasn't been yet affected by mass tourism. So I think that a lot of the provinces should be wary of wanting to strive towards the amount of patronage that comes through Bali, and I'm not sure whether a lot of those local communities are really necessarily behind some of the larger developments that occur within their regions. But I think, fundamentally, if there is some form of, if we want a better word, governance to the scale of development, and also just around amenity and infrastructure that can cope with some of the larger sort of tourism developments, then I guess that's what and also just all the regions that are selected, they've been selected because they're so pristine and untouched, and that's a real danger with the extent of tourism that has occurred in Bali. So yeah, I'd say with a grain of salt to be wary, careful what you wish for.
That does it for this episode. Join us for a special treat in the next episode, which will also be our final for this season. See you soon.